Good evening, and welcome to the Democracy Series, hosted by the Center for Effective Government and the Chicago Center on Democracy at the University of Chicago and the Seminary Co-op Bookstores. My name is Kevin Cromash, and I'm the Senior Research Associate at the Chicago Center on Democracy. And at the Center for Effective Government and the Chicago Center on Democracy, we bring together scholars and practitioners to host discussions and generate ideas about how to strengthen democratic institutions in service of a more effective government. And in this installment of our book series, we're speaking with author Moises Naím on his book, The Revenge of Power: How Autocrats Are Reinventing Politics for the 21st Century. You'll have the opportunity today to hear him speak about various aspects of his book, and we'll save at least 15 minutes for audience questions. So please use the Q&A function if you have a question. Tonight's conversation is being recorded and will be shared on Twitter at UChicagoCEG and at democracy.uchicago.edu. And if you enjoy the conversation today, I encourage you to attend future Democracy Series events where we will speak with other authors to continue exploring the state of democracy. So we have today Moises Naím. He's a highly influential author, internationally syndicated columnist, and distinguished fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Dr. Naím is the former trade minister of Venezuela and director of the country's central bank, and former executive director of the World Bank. He's the chief international columnist and global observer for the largest daily newspapers in Spain and Italy, with columns carried by all leading newspapers in Latin America. Previously, he relaunched the prominent journal Foreign Policy and served 14 years as editor. Among other high praise, former US President Bill Clinton said of his previous work that it will change the way you read the news, the way you think about politics, and the way you look at the world. Tonight's book, The Revenge of Power, provides an important and original look at threats and opportunities for democracy across the globe. And I'm also delighted to present our moderator, the director of the Chicago Center on Democracy, Professor Susan Stokes. In addition to her role as the center's director, Sue is the Margaret Blake Distinguished Service Professor in the University of Chicago's Political Science Department. So Sue and Moises, I'll turn it over to you for what I know will be an exciting conversation.
Well, welcome everyone, and what an honor and what a pleasure to have Moises Naím with us today. We're gonna have Moises say a few things about his book. I'm going to have a few questions. We'll have a little conversation after that, and then as Kevin Cromash mentioned, we will open up. We're delighted to take questions that you can write in the Q&A section on the Zoom. So Moises, talk to us about The Revenge of Power, which I'll just start by saying I enjoyed very much. Among other things, like your other books, it's extremely entertainingly and engagingly written. So any of you out there who think this is going to be a kind of heavy, dull read, you've got the wrong author. So Moises, go ahead.
Thank you, Sue. It's a pleasure interacting with you today. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, the Harris Center, Public Policy Center. I'm very happy to be chatting with you. About 10 years ago, I published a book called The End of Power, that essentially argued that in the 21st century, power had become easier to acquire, harder to use, and easier to lose. It was more ephemeral. And that was happening everywhere, from the Vatican to the Pentagon, to the halls of power in Wall Street, to Hollywood, to labor unions, culture clubs, sports clubs, military, newspapers, media, everywhere, power had become more ephemeral, especially in politics. That was 10 years ago. The book, 9 to be precise, but the book was written 1 year prior to publication. So it was a 10-year-old kind of journey, a journey that was very eventful. It was China's GDP in that period from 2011 to 2021. China's GDP went from 6 trillion to 15. We saw the explosion of social media, both in terms of profitability, as in reach, as in political influence. We had and suffered the financial crisis, 2009, 2010, that had very long tails, in my judgment, and we're still seeing the consequences of that crash, and especially the way in which it was tackled and quote unquote resolved. Inequality boomed, at least in the United States and in other wealthy countries. It reached levels in economic inequality, income, wealth inequality, social mobility started suffering in ways that it had not seen before. Climate change accelerated. Artificial intelligence also accelerated automation and the disruptions in the way we work, and of course the pandemic, of course Donald Trump, and I can go on and on and on about the world-changing events of the last decade. That list, and we all have that list, but that list seldom includes a very important factor, and that is that in that decade, democracy suffered deeply. The number of countries that were, the NGOs and organizations and think tanks that specialize in measuring democracy. You can quibble about some of the methodologies, but the convergence, the consensus is that the past decade was a terrible decade for democracy in terms of how many people in the world lived in the autocracies increased significantly. Larry Diamond, the professor at Stanford, coined the term the democratic recession. He argued that the world was undergoing a recession of democracy, of freedoms, of the checks and balances that limit the concentration of power. And so the book, the new book, the book, the decade-old book was The End of Power. The new book is The Revenge of Power. And it's based on the notion that the people and institutions who held power were not going to just sit back and relax and wait to be displaced or challenged or coerced by newcomers and by the same forces of power dilution that I discussed in the first book. So they put up resistance and they deployed all kinds of tricks and methods and strategies and tactics. So if in the first book I discussed the centrifugal forces that disperse power, in this new book I discussed the centripetal forces that concentrate power. And power is then tends to be abused and democracy tends to suffer. In the book, I mentioned the 3 Ps. I say that a lot of these new autocrats use the 3 Ps to acquire power and retain it: populism, polarization, and post-truth. In the book, I show how, even though these are very old concepts and we have seen them before, in the 21st century, they combine in very different ways that have acquired heightened potency and are very effectively deployed by these autocrats that want to look like democrats and stealthily undermine governments from within. So we saw a whole slew of government, a whole cohort of autocrats that eventually won elections democratically, but as soon as they got to power, started undermining it from within. By limiting checks and balances, weakening, neutralizing them, and all in very, very often in highly stealthy ways, in ways that are not easily detected by the naked eye or by the eye of non-experts. Presidential decrees in the middle of the night, the buying of members of the Supreme Courts, the influence over Congress, the purchasing by cronies to the government of mass media, so they can claim that they have an independent private sector, privately owned mass media, but in effect, these were employees of the government that immediately, as soon as they got their hand in the newspaper chains or the radio and TV networks, they put them at the service of the regime. All of that has been happening in very profound ways. It is changing the world in very important ways. It belongs to the list of the most important things that happened in the past decade. But in a lot of countries, we were sleepwalking towards autocracy. And it's time to stop that and be aware that democracy everywhere is under threat and requires attention, urgent attentions, and new ways of doing things. let me stop here and we can expand some of the ideas I mentioned.
Yeah, no, that's a great start. Let me just ask a couple of questions that I about issues, topics you touch on in the book that I found very striking. So on the 3 Ps, you mentioned that there's that. So you mentioned that we know these phenomena already. That they've been with us for a long time. There have been populist leaders for centuries. Polarization is something that is familiar. When I was growing up, the people who were against the war in Vietnam hated the people who were in favor of it, and so on. And post-truth, I mean, there have been, there's been in the United States and in other countries as well, kind of problems with the general public understanding or being willing to grasp scientific truths or other kinds of truths. So I wondered if you could go a little more deeply into one of those 3, the populism, and explain to us maybe with some examples, what is it that makes a current populist politician different from a more conventional, more traditional politician operating in a democratic system?
That's a great question. And so the first is that it's more stealthy. It's less on your face. If they can get away with it, they want to look like Democrats. It's very interesting how at the same time that democracy is in decline, the appetite of dictators to look like Democrats is heightened. And we see that all the time. Populism has always existed. It is often confused with an ideology. But the reality is that, we have populists of the left, of the right, of the north, of the side, of the south, everywhere. Populism is not an ideology. Populism is a bag of tricks, tools, strategies, and tactics designed to divide and conquer. Is it based on that old idea? And is divide the nation between the noble people that is being abused by a corrupt elite. And that often creates conditions for the emergence of a charismatic leader that then promises to take care, protect, and support the noble people that has been exploited by this hypocritical elite. So that is the historical pattern, the emergence of a leader that promises, that claims that everything that had happened before is horrible, negative, needs to be forgotten or destroyed, and that a new reality, a new political life, a new economic arrangements will take care of poverty and inequality and crime and exclusion and unhappiness. But the problem now is that polarization has boomed. As you said, it has always existed also, but now it is combined with all kinds of identities, that make, there is like polarization is like cholesterol. You have good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. Good polarization is the one that is democracy, in which you have different interest groups, different groups representing different goals that have to interact and battle over the control of government, and eventually is resolved by an election. That's good. That's democracy at work. But there is a different kind of polarization that is bad, which is the one that is so deep that doesn't even allow the government to govern, that there is gridlock, there is the impossibility, rivals are not even given their right to exist and exert political power or have ambitions. And the identity dimension of this has increased thanks to post-truth. As you said correctly, so polarization and post-truth have always existed. Hitler had a ministry of propaganda. Mussolini did that too. Today, the Chinese government has a ministry of propaganda. The thing is that post-truth is not just a government pushing for support and manipulating the population. Post-truth creates a whole new environment in which you don't need, first of all, it's not just governments, but it's both governments, free agents, or agents that seem to be free but are at the service of governments. And the reality is that the impact has been amplified by technologies and by social media. And so you have an empowered and energized and amplified set of post-truth realities that are influencing the identity politics that heighten polarization, that in turn create a very welcoming environment for populism. So you have to take the three and understand that they come as a package that reinforce each other, and they have elements that have always been with us, but now in this century, they have acquired a new hue and new potency. I'm sorry it was too long, but
No, thank you. No, another aspect of the book that I found really interesting was your description of support. This connects with the notion of political identities and polarization. The notion that followers of political leaders, especially these sort of populist leaders, they sort of think of them more as the way that fans think of celebrities. So people who love, I don't know, Britney Spears or something, they think about them that way rather than as leaders of political parties that take positions on policies and that have to run government in a competent way. And I think you're right to be very concerned. That's not the model of citizenship that we think goes well with, democratic accountability. And I was thinking as I was reading that part of the book that there's another kind of fan, at least in the United States. So I'm a baseball fan, and baseball fans are very critical of their teams. So, the second that our Chicago White Sox start underperforming as they are at the moment, everybody becomes the new, has messages for the manager and wants the manager to do things differently. So it's a more kind of participatory and, I love you, but I don't want you to work this way. I want you to do better kind of model. So I'm just wondering, in your discussion of these sort of, it's almost like fans as in kind of the fans of a cult leader, what can be done to kind of shift that to a more sort of maybe loyal but critical kind of stance, and particularly with regard, you talk about the problem of hardball politics and the ways in which fandom of the kind that you're describing can make people more accepting of hardball by their party. Do you have thoughts about, you talk a good deal at the end of the book about sort of what can be done, but talk to us about what your thoughts are about how to shift the model of citizen support for their party so it's a more effective and more meaningful.
The relationship between followers and leaders has always existed in complicated ways. And Weber was originally one that identified the follower that has some special condition, the leader that has special conditions that make followers follow in ways that are very deeply connected to that person's identity. And in some cases, that identity is related to sports clubs. And the way you aptly described what happens with baseball fans, it has echoes with soccer fans in Europe. In Europe, soccer fans also insult and send messages and ugly messages both to their players and especially the coaches. That they call them technical directors, and they just get hit with all kinds of insults when things don't go well, and then they become semi-gods and heroes when the team wins. And the three P politicians have discovered that fandom yields better results because it also increases fealty and fidelity and commitment. Remember when Donald Trump said that he could go down on Manhattan in Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and nothing would happen? Well, that has resonance with the notion that they have a leader, that they allow the leader to do whatever he wants. And we have seen that. We have seen how the followers of the Republican Party in many senses, but of Donald Trump, are willing to believe anything and are willing to follow him to wherever he takes them. So that's fandom. That's the use of the techniques and the methods that create the leaders that are very attractive and can get away with anything based on the fealty of their of the followers. So your very good question is then what to do. What to do has a lot to do in turn with how often we see segments of the population acting against their own interests. And that is in part explicable by post-truth and the messages of post-truth, but also by the kind of leader they have that can take them to places that are not convenient to them, but they don't care because that's the way that has been chosen by the leader they follow.
Just to follow up on the issue of hardball politics, which you have very interesting things to talk about in the book. There's all kinds of important debates within the Biden administration and in the Democratic Party and so forth about whether to engage in hardball in response to hardball or whether to stick with what we might think of as more norm respecting kind of policies. So, for example, as you know, what to do about the January 6th, not just the people who took part, but the people who seem to be planning it. How aggressive should the Attorney General be in possibly pursuing criminal prosecution against a former president? Those are very difficult questions, and as you point out in the book, there's all kinds of hardball issues that are equivalent, if not identical, in other parts of the world, in particular where we have these sort of backsliding parties and leaders. What's your view on that? Do you meet fire with fire? Do you meet fire with a better way? What are your feelings about that?
I think this is a crucial question and what to do, and a lot hangs on how this decision is made and in which direction. The first reaction is that this is country specific. The way you will deal with this in Italy is different than the way you deal with this in the United States, or Spain, or Thailand, or Hungary, and surely Russia. So it is country specific, it's circumstances specific, it's issue specific. In the United States, we are debating, and some of these hardball and deeply contested, ferociously contested, are about issues that do not matter that much in other countries, and in other countries they fight over things that do not have any resonance in the United States. And in general, at the high level of abstraction, you could say that there are two words that should protect a nation from that. One is the Constitution, and the second is democracy. When you see, we talk a lot about guardrails and make sure that they contain excesses and distortions and deviations of democratic behavior. Well, we need to be attentive to those. And those very often are very obscure, are very technical, are very lawyerly, very hard to grasp. But they need to be placed at the center of the conversation and make sure and ensure that the guardrails are fortified and respected, especially the basic constitutional rules. And the other is democracy. A lot of the problems of democracy are typically solved or better dealt with more democracy.
I'm gonna take advantage of the fact that that you are a Venezuelan and have played a very important role in earlier periods in Venezuelan public affairs. And I teach a class on democratic erosion here at the University of Chicago. And when we talk about Venezuela, it's kind of democratic erosion is in the past tense. There's not much democracy left to erode, and it's a sad state of affairs. Talk to us a little bit about how the themes of the book connect to that country and the themes of sort of diagnosis of what went wrong, but also the themes of what could be done.
So a lot of my interest on 3 Ps and the way I came up with the idea of having these presidents or leaders that depend on the 3 Ps was of course driven by my experience watching how my country lost its democracy. Slowly, as a process, invisibly, sometimes with in-your-face decisions by the president, And so as I watched Donald Trump run for office, win office, and become the president and do what he did, I kept saying myself, I have seen this movie before, except that it was in Spanish. So perhaps the most important point is that erosions of democracy were typically not erosion, but just breaking up democracy. It was a coup. And so a general put on his dark sunglasses, and says, I'm it. I run the country. I am head of the junta, and my soldiers are in the streets, and the tanks are ready to shoot at you. And that's it. Well, that still happens. We just saw it in Myanmar and Burma recently. But the norm now is there is a slow moving, hard to detect process of undermining, neutralizing checks and balances and term limits and all that. And so that's the way it happened in Venezuela. And Hugo Chavez started by lying. And again, we can talk about how the normalization of lying is now a very important part of the toolkit of leaders around the world. The big lie is now seems to be the norm in a lot of countries. And so the process in which there was lying, there was distortion, there was undermining, laws, regulations, traditions, and routines were clearly, an attack on democracy, except that it was a process. It was a sliding down the path of autocracy in ways that were very powerful and also very stealthy.
Great. Well, we have a question from an audience member, and let me just read it to you. This is from David Reyes. What's your view on what is happening in Central America? Do you consider El Salvador's president an autocrat?
There is this continuum where you have North Korea on one side and Switzerland in the other. Switzerland is the most democratic, or whatever the Scandinavian countries, hyper democracy, highly consolidated, well functioning, norms are respected, and then you have the totalitarian type of leader that we see in North Korea. And so the question is, where do you put President Bukele? Well, he was elected democratically and is trying to govern like that, but he clearly has been using methods that are not democratic. We have seen him doing things that are clearly autocratic in nature. And I think we will be surprised both in good ways and in bad ways by the way he's handling the situations. The good ways is that sometimes he shows an interest in, of being respected by the international community and not to be seen as another banana republic dictator. And in other moments, he does things that are just horribly anti-democratic. So he is somewhere in the middle of that continuum between North Korea and Switzerland or Sweden or Norway.
So to follow up on the idea of the views of the international community and sort of the international dynamics of these aspiring autocrats, I want to ask you, this is unfair because this has happened after you've written the book, but I'm sure you have some views on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what that means for what we might have called an international cabal of aspiring autocrats. Do you think that there are fissures that have opened up in that kind of alliance or cabal, or do you see are there any silver linings that come out of this sort of very almost caricatured act of international aggression coming from a leading figure who's much admired by autocrats operating in democracies around the world?
Yes, well, and Putin is surely one of an extreme example of the three Ps, and extremes are always good to illustrate what one wants to describe. There is, let me start with the tragedy. The tragedy is we have the 19th century kind of behavior in the 21st century that caught everybody by surprise. And Putin seems to not to mind just destroying a country and killing innocents and seeing the atrocities that we have seen. You know, everybody had thought that was a 19th century kind of behavior that was, you know, no longer with us. And the notion was that the more you intertwine an economy with trade and investment and business and economic links, the more you were protecting that country and neighbors and others from being the victims of a war like we are seeing now. Well, that proved not to be the case, and we're seeing the consequences. The silver lining is that Europe discovered that they were a superpower but had not realized it. Europe, by finding unity, by not just doing the typical procedures that are common in Brussels, in the European Union, but they, you know, just in a very bold, very effective way, the governments just got together and moved with unity in this, and discovered that they were important players. And Europe is now an important geopolitical player. We don't know how sustainable it is and how long it will, you know, the coalition will be sustained, but surely they now know what they need to do in order to be important, significant players that can shape us the global realities.
Probably an initial thing that happened has been the opening of Poland to enormous numbers of refugees from Ukraine, and really moving kind of the government obviously welcoming refugees, but just common people from Poland being so warm and generous in their reception. Now behind that is a reality of fear, I think. So that was very heartening, and then somehow the reaction of Viktor Orban in Hungary, which happened fairly quickly, was less encouraging. Do you think that there's going to be kind of a new set of alliances? Do you think that Russia will be more and more isolated? Do you think that there is any room for, is there any kind of breathing room between Russia and China at this point?
Yeah, as you notice, I did not respond to your point about the cabal, because the cabal feels to me far more structural, determined, and permanent. And here, what we're seeing is highly volatile. Is very new. Is many of what we, a lot of what we see is unprecedented. And I think it's just Chu Enlai, the famous Chinese premier in the 70s, was asked what did he think were the consequences of a French Revolution, and he thought for a little bit, and they said, well, it's too soon to tell. And I think it's too soon to tell. I think there will be alliances. The most important one is, what role will China play here? Will China be an ally of Russia, an anti-American coalition? Or will it be a peacemaker and will be a country that can then decide that it will use its might and its weight and its influence internationally to try to make peace, to force peace in the region, or is just a spectator? So is three scenarios: ally to Putin, peacemaker, or spectator, and that is still ongoing. I don't think even the Chinese have a definitive answer to that question. But those are three clear scenarios for that. Of all the possible alliances, that one, the way in which China will develop its relationship with Putin's Russia, is going to be one of the most important.
I suppose the answer to the question also will depend to some degree on the outcome of the war, which is very much still in question.
Exactly.
We have a question from Steve Stein. Can you talk more about the social, political, and economic context that led to the intensification of the 3 Ps?
Yeah, there is a bunch of them. As I said, there is a very important tail, consequences of the financial crisis of 2009, 2010, and the way it was resolved. I think technology has played a role and will continue to play a role. Artificial intelligence is going to hit every one of us in ways that we cannot even imagine yet. Some of them very positive, some of them quite complicated and difficult to stomach. And so technology is very important in this, but so is climate change. A lot of the frictions we have seen in the world these days are still connected with climate change. With the sociology, the social political conditions are what's coming soon. What I think I'm worried about it is not what are the past forces that have driven the 3 Ps, but the new ones. And the new ones is a very potent and explosive combination of inflation and disdain for democracy. Inflation is at a 40-year high. That means that there are at least 2 generations that did not live with inflation, that don't know what inflation is, that have not had the experience of seeing their salaries disappear quickly and vaporize. Inflation is a terrible thing. It's very hard to, once it gets entrenched, it's very hard to eradicate. And so this importance, this heightened importance of inflation and its political consequences is going to coincide with, again, 2 cohorts at least or more of people that have not lived in autocracies, and therefore, they can talk with disdain of democracy because they don't know what's the alternative. They have not lived in the alternative to the regime that they so disdain, that they feel it's not delivering, that they feel is malfunctioning and all that. And they are right. The democracy in the 21st century needs to be repaired and fixed and updated. That's for sure, but not tossed out in favor of autocracies. So democracy needs to be repaired, not thrown out and replaced by a 3P dictator.
Question from Amy Carr in the audience. Could you respond more to the second half of Sue's question, how to respond or move out of authoritarianism back to democracy, for example, in Hong Kong or Venezuela? You're getting very simple questions here.
Yeah, the one-liners with a lot of work is the answer. No, those are very fair questions. Those are the questions that are elicited by a lot of what I described in the book. There is not a one-liner, there's not one solution, but there are, in order to win this war, we need to win several battles. One of the battles is to end the peaceful coexistence with lies. I already mentioned it, but unless we get around there should be higher costs and consequences for leaders that lie. Boris Johnson and Brexit, Donald Trump and his election, Putin and his insisting that he was just doing military maneuvers, that he did not plan to invade Ukraine. Those lies, very big lies, and they lie and nothing happens. I think it's very important that the things begin to happen. I am optimistic that we will all have, that there is a convergence brewing of conditions that will make, post-truth different. I think we will have technologies that will allow all of us to know more about what is it that we are reading and who's sending it and with what interest and what ulterior motives. And that it will enable us to think twice before retweeting or resending or liking a message. And so technology is on there. I know there is a pipeline of projects and apps and innovations that are going to disrupt the line in very interesting ways, especially because they're going to be combined with new rules and regulations like the ones approved by European Union last week, which is very important kinds of regulations. And I think the protection of the digital consumer protections agencies are normal around the world. Everyone has it. You know, markets fail and they are not that good at, for example, ensuring that the food we eat is perfectly healthy. And so there are, you know, it is accepted that markets can fail and that consumers can be protected in very specific ways. And that's true for everything except for digital consumers. All of us are intensive users and consumers of of digital products, but we are not protected by anybody. And so I think that will change. And so the combination of these three things and changing habits of how, you know, digital hygiene will become very important part. I think it's going to help us deal with the truth or the post-truth confusions that we have. And then after that, if we get that right, there are all the things that are in the book. The whole final chapter spells out 5 battles that need to be won in order to win the big war, which is protecting democracy.
I recommend to the audience, one of the things that's really terrific about the book is that it does come around to it's a wonderful diagnosis of many of the things that we've been observing and we've been living through, but it also has some very fresh and interesting things to say about what's to be done, what can we do, what can governments do, what can civic organizations do, and what can individuals do to kind of push back against some of these trends. I'm very tempted to ask you a totally unfair hot take on Elon Musk buying Twitter with regard to our digital universe, but I'm gonna hold back on that because we have another question.
But before you take the question, I just want to say that I spent about an hour today with a group of friends on Zoom discussing who was more dangerous, a bigger threat to democracy, Elon Musk or Vladimir Putin. And that's a joke.
Well, I know how I would vote, but yeah, no, it's interesting that question comes up. So Yang Jiang in the chat has asked, there's a difference between populists as a movement against the establishment vis-a-vis populists in power. So the difference between populists who are heading movements and populists who are actually in power, with the former often trying to repoliticize social cleavages and represent a segment of the people not recognized, represented, and integrated by the mainstream parties. How should we make this distinction, therefore, treat differently between populist energy that calls for social integration, that strengthens democracy, and populists in power that may wreak havoc on governance?
So I don't know the answer to that question. That's a tough question. And essentially, I will take the part that says, you know, we have two kinds of populists, those that are already caught power and are in charge and are undermining democracy from inside. And the populists that are outside making all kinds of promises that they will not, you know, they will not be able to deliver, but still are very attractive to voters. And we have seen the elections in France, for example, are very revealing of these kinds of things. And what perhaps the most important thing to know is that for a populist that doesn't need a majority. A populist needs, they don't need to win by landslide. They just need a small majority and a divided electorate. So promoting different candidates, promoting different movements, promoting the fragmentation of the electorate is the strategy that they're using. and both those that are inside the government, that they have power, those that want power, that what they need, what they do, what we have been watching them doing is fragmenting the electoral space. And therefore, they just need to get a majority within a highly fragmented identity-based kind of civics electoral space.
I want to ask you a question that's connected to what we were talking about before, sort of the big lie and how to push back against it, and bring the focus back to the U.S. for a minute. Many people, and you included, are very concerned about the future of American democracy and the future, in the fairly proximate future, the 2024 presidential elections. The fear is that whatever happens, whoever wins, one side or the other is going to be not just frustrated, but actually not believe that the outcome was the result of fair processes. And there may be, maybe those beliefs are more grounded in truth on one side than the other, but nevertheless, those beliefs are going to be somewhat inimical, presumably to democracy, where we rely on kind of a peaceful transition of power when that takes place. So I wanted just to ask you about, what can there are a number of really great suggestions, particularly in the last part of the book. What would you recommend to people? Here we are, we're in the Midwest. Many of us are, teach students who don't feel particularly that they can influence public policy, at least not at this point of their lives. What do you say to so I'm asking you a question that I frequently am asked by young people in particular. Common people, no particular sway, no particular connection to power networks and so forth. What can we do?
The truth is that we have a vision, most of us have a vision of democracy as one event every 5 years, every 4 years, depending on the country. So elections are, for many people, are the only relationship they have with democracy. They vote once. And so it's imperative that people start understanding that democracy requires more than a few hours on a line to vote. There is a lot of activities that are related to democracy that need the attention of people like your students, and the opportunities are there. It may not look easy, and the barriers to entry may seem very high, but the fact of the matter is that the space exists. One area where it is indispensable to strengthen democracy is in the whole logistics of elections. We have seen how the Trump campaign and the Trump-related entities are taking over. The Republican parties are spending a lot of money and ensuring that the officers in charge of the vote counting and the integrity of the voter situation are partial to Donald Trump and the Republican Party. We have seen the importance of the logistics of elections in the last election, and there is their space in order to activate for whatever party, but to make sure that elections are fair, not just the day of the election, but before the day of the election. There are all kinds of rules, regulations, tricks, technologies may be used to subvert and trick and create more of a sham election.
Question that I'm asking you, mindful of your training as an economist, populists, sort of, when you think about populists in the last century in say in Latin America, perhaps other parts of the world, the United States for that matter, a kind of a thread through their thought was railing against economic elites and arguing in favor of redistribution or sort of improving the economic well-being of the common people, the descamisados or what have you. Land reform in Mexico, if we think about Lázaro Cárdenas as having been an early populist. some would claim that the backdrop of populism today is also enormous inequality in the advanced democracies. Actually, the region that you and I are very familiar with, Latin America, inequality is very high, but actually has improved to some extent. I wonder whether you could talk to us about whether you think that that growing sort of long-term shifts beyond the Great Recession, but long-term shifts in increasing economic inequality in many advanced democracies is a cause of the rise of the phenomenon of the 3P leaders, and also whether you think what you think should be done, how urgent do you think it is to use public policy to address problems of economic inequality?
So already in 2011, I wrote a piece for The Atlantic alerting that inequality was coming, and was coming big time in countries that did not have it for a long period. And I was thinking of the United States, where inequality was beginning to have numbers that we only saw in Latin America, as you mentioned. So the first point is that inequality became a global conversation when the United States and Europe had unacceptable levels of inequality. Going historically, since the statistics on inequality started, Brazil was always the world champion in inequality. There's nothing new for Brazilians, or for Chileans, or for Mexicans, or for Venezuelans about income inequality, wealth inequalities. We have lived with that for many, many years. And they were part of the conversation. But then now the United States has that conversation. And the United States is very effective always at exporting its anxieties. So the national conversation in the United States became the national conversations elsewhere. And that's a very welcome development. We retrieved and placed inequality at the center of the conversation. That's a good thing. We have a long history in Latin America of governments that run on the promise of lowering inequality. And the evidence shows that very often they end up with more inequality, that the tools and strategies and public policies and economic policies that are used very often end up exacerbating inequality for a long list of reasons, some of them country-specific, others just as a result of international conditions and so on. But inequality is, as you said in the question, is at the center of those, of the uneasiness, of the discomfort that most people now have with the situation, their lot in life. And especially those that are seeing how their daily lives are being appended by all sorts of things and inequality, and they see the inequality in a daily basis. So I think it's going to be with us for a while, but the good news is that there is more, we know more about that, and we know more about the importance of dealing with it and lowering it, and avoiding it to be the force that eventually appends democracy around the world.
We have a question from Mariana Prado. I was wondering what your prediction of what will happen if we succeed in stopping the centripetal populist forces. Are we then back at the scenario you mapped in your previous book, The End of Power, i.e., are we back in the scenario of centrifugal forces, or is there another scenario that may ensue? What will this scenario be?
At this point, my hope is that the downward trend of democracies is stopped, contained, and probably reversed. I want more countries to be moving to the category of being called the liberal democracies. That number has been terrible in recent years, in which fewer and fewer countries are moving towards more democracy, and more countries are moving towards less democracy. I think it's imperative that we change that trend. And there is a contagion effect. And again, I go back to your point about the cabal of strong leaders that are the 3P presidents that join each other in subverting democracies in the country and supporting the same movements in other countries. That is happening. We need to stop that too. But again, I don't have grand ambitions for a wholly democratic world. I just want I want the situation to stop the backsliding towards autocracy, and more, even more than that, and as a requirement for that is this sleepwalking towards democracy, towards autocracy. A lot of countries, a lot of leaders, a lot of voters are sleepwalking towards autocracy. And we need to stop that. We need to show what's going on and be more alert and demanding that they pay attention.
I think there are a number of Russian citizens who, many of them have left their country since the invasion, who very much regret not having been more active at an earlier point. Moises Naím, what a pleasure to read your book. What a pleasure to hear from you. I'm going to turn things back over to Kevin Cromash, who's going to say some final words. But thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both for this. This is a fascinating conversation. And thank you everyone who's here on Zoom and those who are watching the YouTube live stream for joining us in this installment of the Democracy series. As a reminder, this is a joint initiative between the Center for Effective Government, Chicago Center on Democracy, and the Seminary Co-op Bookstores that brings you discussions with authors on critical topics of democracy. And you can find us all online. You can find CEG on Twitter at UChicagoCEG, Seminary Co-op at Seminary Co-op, and the Chicago Center on Democracy on our website, democracy.uchicago.edu. So thank you